From January 2016 to June of 2021, the Government of Canada recorded nearly 25,000 opioid-related deaths. In April to June of 2019, opioid-related deaths were occurring at an average of 11 deaths a day. That number has increased during the COVID-19 pandemic, reaching 19 deaths a day in April to June of 2021. From April to June 2021, hospitalizations for opioids reached 16 people a day, and there were 9,782 EMS responses to suspected ODs. Anyone can be addicted to opioids regardless of socioeconomic status, age, ethnicity, religious belief, gender, or sexual orientation. Many people who have become addicted to opioids started by being prescribed opioids. For public safety personnel, responding to opioid-related calls can cause stress. Public safety personnel can be affected by increased exposure to deadly drugs and dirty needles, increased call volume, strain on resources, increased exposure to death and suffering, possibility of multiple patients on one call, repeat calls, unpredictable patients, seeing kids' family affected by the patient's addiction, kids accidentally ingesting parents' opioids.
Hello, my name is Todd Fry, and I am a firefighter with Regina Fire and Protective Services. I know that responding to multiple OD calls can have an impact on public safety personnel. While we can treat the patient for an OD, we cannot fix the larger problem of the opioid epidemic, which at times can make us feel like we are just going in circles. CIPSRT has given me the opportunity to ask a clinician, Dr. Megan McElhern, the most common questions I hear from fellow PSP about coping with what we have seen on our jobs during the opioid epidemic.
Hello, Todd. I am happy to be here to answer your questions.
It's really hard to continue caring about OD patients. What can we do to stop feeling so fed up?
This is a profound statement, and one that I believe causes incredible distress and feelings of guilt in public safety personnel who are so significantly motivated by a desire to help others. What a sincere dilemma to continue to have a desire to help and be of service, but to have feelings of resentment regarding the very people you are attempting to serve. The first point I think it's really important for us to talk about is that we need to normalize and validate that it is perfectly natural to feel jaded and burnt out, particularly when you're confronted with a problem that seemingly doesn't change. One of the necessary principles, I think, for all of us to adopt, but particularly for public safety personnel to adopt in the context of the opioid crisis, is to allow ourselves to have our emotions and our reactions as they are. We actually tend to perpetuate the difficult feelings that we have and the difficult experiences we have when we work to push them away. So when you're feeling jaded or burnt out, the first recommendation, honestly, is just to allow yourself to have that particular feeling or experience without trying to judge it or pushing it away. When you are being asked to attend repeatedly to overdose calls for the same person over and over, it is perfectly natural to have a sense of frustration, to feel fed up. And what we need to do is just allow ourselves to acknowledge those feelings, acknowledge those experiences, and actually in so doing, in many ways, this allows them to pass. There's this saying that whatever we resist persists. And the notion here would be there's nothing wrong with feeling frustrated and fed up. We just simply need to allow ourselves to feel that, and that actually paradoxically that may be the thing that allows the feeling or the experience to move through us in a quicker fashion. And a second consideration that we're going to be talking about throughout these questions, or a theme, relates to ideas of both purpose and control. We all need to have a sense of purpose that motivates our actions, whether that's at work or in our personal lives. So, how do we fight that feeling of feeling jaded or cynical within our working lives or our personal lives? The answer is we have to make a project out of returning to the reasons that motivated us to get into this field in the first place. if you started off your career with a value or a desire to be of service or be able to help your community, that's the principle, that's the value or the foundation we must practice returning to on an ongoing basis, because that is where we are going to find the motivation, find the reason to help us keep going, particularly when we are trying to help patients struggling with opioid addiction. It's not our job to save the world. We simply can't. But if we can come back to those foundational values and the reasons why we wanted to do this work in the first place, sometimes that can be a bit protective for us. And so what that means in a practical way is that we need to stay focused on those things that we actually can control, right? And the things we actually can control are the words we choose to use. We can check our attitudes, right? How am I as I go into this call? We can, focus on or look at how am I interacting with this patient who's just overdosed, right? I can notice that I'm feeling frustrated and, what that's bringing up in me. Those are the things we actually have control over. We don't have control over, if after this particular overdose, that patient's going to go out and, seek more illicit substances and have another overdose. That's out of our control. But we can still turn up reminding ourselves why we wanted to do this work in the first place and really focusing on the things that we have agency or empowerment over. And that, in the long run, we actually know can really help us mitigate or decrease feelings of anxiety and stress and depression.
What do we do with a patient that is mad at us for ruining their high?
So there are several possible approaches to this issue, and likely the response to this needs to be evaluated on a case-by-case, day-by-day basis, as there's probably any number of factors that are going to influence the response to this type of situation. I think the fundamental recommendation that would be made is to try to disseminate the duties of your occupational role as dispassionately as possible. And I 100% understand as I say that is way easier said than done. We do have to try to remember, hard as it may be, that the person struggling with opioid addiction is highly likely to be struggling with feelings of shame, isolation, regret, and probably significant trauma. In fact, Dr. Gabor Mate, a Canadian psychiatrist, suggests that when we're thinking about addiction, instead of asking, why is the person struggling with addiction, we should really focus or consider instead on what's the trauma or the emotional pain that has led to the development of the addiction in the first place, right? So in this sense, if we can come at it from that perspective, the person who has had their high ruined has essentially had their pain management strategies just stripped away from them. If you needed morphine, let's say, to manage your pain after spinal surgery or something like that, and all of a sudden that pain management was taken away, it probably would be pretty natural for you to feel immediately angry and really angry with the person who was responsible for that. For the person struggling with addiction, it's a similar kind of an idea. However, we're in the context of someone who is really trying to numb their emotional pain. So, hard as it may be, as best as possible, the strategy for you when someone is angry with you for ruining their high is to try to actually meet them with compassion and to understand that their anger is really a reflection of the wounds they're carrying around that have not healed inside. So you have to remember, right, as much as you can to depersonalize this, their anger is not about you. Obviously, it's directed your way, and so that it feels intense, it can feel really personal, but it's not about you, right? The person whose high you've ruined, they're in a state of desperation. They're in a state of panic because they're trying to now manage their physical pain, their emotional pain, and probably are feeling somewhat panicked about where they're going to, get that next high from. So we, again, have to focus on what we can control, which is how we're going to engage with folks in that state when they're angry and dysregulated, right? We don't know, and I think this is an important perspective to keep in mind. We don't know what is going to be that thing, that interaction, that act of kindness that might be the thing that motivates someone to actually engage in and maybe be able to sustain change when it comes to overcoming opioid addiction. And so, we have to keep in mind that perhaps your ability in that moment to demonstrate compassion and to show empathy to somebody who is, angry and dysregulated and panicked, that could ultimately be something that they remember. That could be something that sort of, gets in and they remember that, there are good people in the world who didn't just treat them kind of like a piece of garbage, right? And it would be maybe a meaningful thing for you to be that part of that person's story.
How do we deal with the anger of seeing an infant in diapers running around uncared for while we are saving their parent from an OD?
In thinking about seeing children running around uncared for, the children of folks struggling with addiction, I would say that this is the very definition of a moral injury. It violates everything about how people should behave and how children should be taken care of. The first intervention, I think, in this example is really just to pause and kind of like we've already talked about, give yourself that opportunity to acknowledge and process any feelings of anger or maybe disgust that might be kind of natural in this type of circumstance. That's a very natural, understandable way to feel in the context of children not being taken care of. The second is then to go, okay, what are the next reasonable steps that I can take that, are reasonable and appropriate to address the situation? And so, likely with children running around uncared for in potentially an unsafe environment, the next step is to make a call to Child and Family Services. And it's really important to recognize that these are circumstances that do require a higher degree of intervention, and it's far beyond the scope of what you as an individual public safety member can reasonably take responsibility for. So, your job in those moments is to bear witness to that, to take the next steps that are appropriate, so involving systems on a larger scale, to respond to the protection needs of these children, and to, hopefully provide intervention to parents who are clearly so overwhelmed in their ability to care for these children, right? So again, it is okay to feel angry in this situation, but rather than internalize that anger and sort of get stuck on it and stew on it, what we want to do is mobilize that into doing what needs to be done, calling the police, calling Child Protective Services, shedding a light on a family that is struggling and a family that needs more help and resources. And I think it's important to really note, right? Like, while that may not feel like doing much, or why that might also seem sort of obvious or something like that, what you've done by leveraging and involving higher systems and higher levels of responsibilities, you've clearly communicated, you've borne witness to what's happening in this family, and you've clearly communicated that what you've witnessed is unacceptable, and that as a sort of rational and healthy adult witness coming into this circumstance, you're taking the reasonable steps that are needed in order to take care of these children in a situation or a circumstance that you did not create, right? So acknowledge, take rational, appropriate steps, and then after responding with the practical interventions, you do need to then find those opportunities to connect authentically with someone that you trust, that you can talk about, the impact on you of what you just witnessed, right? There's not an obvious or immediate solution to the opioid epidemic and the impact on children because of the opioid epidemic. Rather, we're again having to focus on, what do you need? What is it at the level of you as the individual that you need to do to keep, processing and acknowledging that these things are hard to experience, right? And really recognizing that there is a limit to how much responsibility you can bear in this particular example of children being uncared for, but it's natural and it's necessary for you to need to talk through what you experienced with someone that you trust, right? And so, this could be with a peer, this could be, at home with your partner, this could be with your whole crew, a therapist, really, it doesn't matter, but you do need to remind yourself or give yourself permission that, like, just stopping and pausing and talking about the impact of this on you is part of actually how you keep yourself healthy.
Are we actually helping in this epidemic?
I think this is one of the questions, this idea of like, is what we're doing actually helping? I suspect this extends beyond the opioid epidemic at times, and may be a question that public safety members struggle with in terms of their jobs as a whole. And, we all want to feel like the help that we're disseminating is actually helpful, and yet we don't always get feedback to indicate that that's true. And I think one of the things that influences this is that we all have been somewhat socialized to think about outcomes as a very sort of cause and effect type of thing. What I mean by that is that we've been taught through various means to expect that if we have a problem, we come up with a solution that then results in the solving of that problem. If my car runs out of gas, I fill it up with gas and it will run again, right? A sort of leads to B. But when we're working with people and in human-centric industries, often we're faced with problems that don't have clear or obvious solutions. We're thus left with having to have faith and trust in the impact of the process we bring to a problem over the ultimate experience of change or of the person being helped. So in this sense, what we're tasked with is actually familiarizing ourselves and getting comfortable with process-based solutions. If I drop a rock in a lake, there's going to be ripples that extend out far beyond where I drop the rock, which may extend beyond what I can actually see or perceive. And the work that you're doing in public safety is kind of like this. You don't know necessarily or know immediately that the help you're offering is actually influencing change, and you don't necessarily know or immediately see the impact that your contribution has made to the people that you are serving. We are left to do our best to show up, to bear witness, to provide the best interventions available to us, and then we have to take comfort in the potential for the help we've offered to have an impact that may be, far on down the line beyond what we can see. We simply don't know if you're turning up the second, 40th, or 100th overdose for a particular patient is the time when your help and your intervention finally influences a change in the course of the patient's life. What we can expect, however, is that we may not immediately see the impact of our help to that person in terms of measurable or obvious change. We have lots of research and experience that tells us that people are most likely to change in contexts in which they receive compassion and patience versus shaming and blame. Thus, if you can focus on showing up to overdose calls with the goal of staying in charge of what you can control, with a hope that your actions may be influencing change in more subtle, less obvious ways for the individual you are attempting to help, you may find that you have more confidence or comfort in the knowledge that you are actually helping in the face of the opioid epidemic. Perhaps we can work to take solace in the idea from the Talmud that says, "Whoever saves one life saves the world entire."
How do we stop from feeling so helpless? It seems like no matter how many times we come and save this patient, we will be back tomorrow or the next week to save the same patient again.
As we've been discussing during this conversation, the first recommendation when you're feeling helpless would be to not stop yourself from feeling helpless. Again, it's perfectly natural to feel helpless when confronted with a seemingly helpless situation, and being asked to turn up again and again to rescue someone who consistently places themselves in peril could be seen as a hopeless situation. After allowing yourselves to have your feelings and to feel them as they are, the next recommendation is again to work to depersonalize what is happening in the circumstance. As much as you are being asked to save the same person over and over, it is important to challenge the interpretation that because this individual continues to require support and has not changed, that their behavior is somewhat less deserving of support and intervention. We understand that it requires a multitude of attempts to conquer an addiction, and specifically an addiction to opioids. And so it could very well be that every time you show up to help the same person, you are actually helping them to get closer to a more substantive change in their lives. Perhaps not, right? But at the end of the day, we don't get to choose what's an emergency. right? Instead, it's our duty in the helping professions to turn up and to try to help the person who needs us, independent of whether we perceive them to be deserving of our help or whether we consider their emergency to be a true emergency. This is where the challenge to engage in our work with caring, but as dispassionately as possible, comes into play. So I would encourage you to consider what it might be like from the perspective of the patient to have you turn up repeatedly to help them. While it might not appear as though there is appreciation or recognition on behalf of that patient, you could maybe take comfort in knowing that on some level it is not escaping the patient's awareness that you are the one turning up and that you have been turning up week after week. Try not to lose sight of how powerful that might be for the person, even on a subconscious level, to know that there are people in the world who still do care enough to turn up, even when it is the same situation over and over. Coming back to that idea of process-based reasoning, we simply don't know how your turning up over and over might actually be bringing that person closer to making a change. As on some level, they are experiencing that you are not giving up on them, and perhaps that might help them to reconsider whether they should be giving up on themselves.
How do we justify using resources on all of these OD calls when we could be responding to other emergencies?
So a simple way to think about this issue is that it is actually not your job to have to justify how resources are deployed. What I have seen in my career working with public safety members is that public safety members tend to have an extremely well-developed sense of responsibility and this focus on service before self. And thus it's common for you to be vulnerable to taking on responsibility for things that are not yours to own. So I would encourage you to reflect on this idea in the context of the opioid epidemic and the repeated responding to the same individual who has overdosed. Whether it is the first, the 10th, or the 50th time you've attended to that individual, on the day in question and given the circumstance, it is an emergency for that person at that particular point in time. It is not your job to have to take responsibility for determining if it is a good use of resources or not. Going back to what we've already talked about, that is beyond the scope of what you can control. What is within your control in the context of the opioid epidemic is how you take care of yourself. By allowing yourself to feel and acknowledge the impact of overdose experiences on you and on your emotions. You can focus on how you turn up to these calls, and you can work to find some way of conjuring up empathy and compassion for the person struggling with opioid dependence. You can consider how you take care of yourself and the people you lean on to debrief and receive support after you attend a troubling call. And you can take stock of what is within your sphere of influence and that which is not. If your department has a mandate to respond to emergencies and someone has overdosed, that is an emergency, whether it is the first or 100th time that individual has overdosed. So long as you are doing the best you can in the context of the information, the resources, and the abilities you have in a given situation, you're doing the job that has been asked of you.